The basement was cold, dark, and smelled of damp concrete mixed with something metallic that Sarah recognized as dried blood. She had been counting the days by the thin sliver of light that came through a crack in the small window near the ceiling. 23 days. 23 days since her world had turned upside down. Sarah. Chen had been a regular intelligence analyst working for a private security firm in Washington. Her job was simple and boring. Reviewing financial records and flagging suspicious transactions that might indicate money laundering or terrorist funding. She sat at a desk, drank too much coffee, and went home to her small apartment every evening. Nothing about her life suggested she would end up chained to a wall in an abandoned warehouse somewhere in Eastern Europe. The mission that brought her here had seemed routine at first. Her company had been hired to investigate a series of suspicious transactions linked to a network of shell companies. Sarah's boss, Marcus Webb, had personally assigned her to the case. He told her it was an opportunity to prove herself, to move beyond desk work and into field operations. She had been excited, naive, and completely unprepared for what was waiting. The investigation had led her to Budapest, where she was supposed to meet an informant who had information about the financial network. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe near the river. Sarah had arrived early, wearing a wire and carrying a small tracking device in her purse. But the informant never showed up. Instead, 3 men in dark suits had approached her table. Before she could react, one of them had pressed something into her side that sent electricity coursing through her body. She remembered collapsing, remembered being dragged into a van, and then nothing but darkness until she woke up in this basement. Her captors had questioned her repeatedly during those first few days. They wanted to know who she worked for, what she knew about their operation, and who else was investigating them. Sarah had tried to stay strong, giving them only her name and insisting she was just a tourist who had been grabbed by mistake. But they didn't believe her. The leader of the group was a man who called himself Dmitri. He was tall and thin with cold gray eyes that seemed to look right through her. He spoke perfect English with just a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. Dmitri was patient in a way that terrified her more than violence would have. He would sit across from her for hours, asking the same questions over and over, waiting for her to slip up, to reveal something she shouldn't. On the 5th day, everything changed. Dmitri had come down to the basement with a laptop. He set it on a crate in front of her and turned the screen so she could see. Her heart had dropped into her stomach. On the screen were photographs of her apartment, her favorite coffee shop, her gym. But worse than that were the photos of her younger sister, Emily, who lived in Seattle. "You see, Sarah?" Dmitri had said calmly. "We know everything about you. We know you work for Sentinel Security Solutions. We know you were investigating our financial operations. And we know that you have people you care about who would be very sad if something happened to you or to them." Sarah had felt tears streaming down her face. "Please," she had whispered. "My sister has nothing to do with this. She doesn't even know what I really do for work." Dmitri had smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I suggest you start cooperating. Tell us everything you know. Tell us who else is involved in the investigation, and your sister stays safe. Refuse, and well, accidents happen every day." That was when Sarah realized the full horror of her situation. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was leverage. Her captors weren't going to kill her quickly because she was more valuable alive, at least for now. But they had no problem threatening everyone she loved to get what they wanted. Over the following days, Sarah had given them small pieces of information. Things she thought wouldn't compromise the investigation too badly but would keep them satisfied. She told them about the shell companies she had been tracking, about the transaction patterns she had identified. She gave them names of low-level contacts, people who wouldn't be in real danger, but she held back the crucial details. The information that would expose the entire network and the people at the top. Dmitri seemed satisfied with her cooperation. But Sarah noticed he was always watching her carefully, looking for signs that she was holding something back. The other guards were less sophisticated. There were usually 2 or 3 of them rotating shifts. They would bring her food once a day, usually bread and water, sometimes a thin soup. They would escort her to a bathroom down the hall twice a day. They barely spoke to her, treating her like a piece of furniture, but Sarah was watching them too. During those bathroom breaks, during the interrogations, during every moment she wasn't completely alone, she was observing. She noticed that the guard named Victor always locked the basement door, but sometimes forgot to engage the deadbolt. She noticed that the cameras in the hallway had blind spots near the corners. She noticed that around 3 in the morning, the warehouse became very quiet. Suggesting fewer guards on duty during those hours, Sarah had no formal combat training. No experience in escape and evasion, no skills that would help her in this situation. But she had something else. She had a mind trained to notice patterns, to analyze information, to see connections that others missed, and she was determined to survive. On day 15, something unexpected happened. She overheard an argument between Dmitri and another man whose voice she didn't recognize. They were speaking in Russian, which Sarah didn't understand, but their tone was clearly angry. She heard her name mentioned several times, along with what sounded like disagreement about what to do with her. After that argument, the atmosphere changed. The guards became nervous, checking on her more frequently. Dmitri stopped coming down for interrogations. Sarah sensed that something had shifted, and her instincts told her it wasn't good. She suspected that her usefulness was running out, that they had gotten what they needed from her. Now she was becoming a liability. That night, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer for rescue. She didn't even know if anyone was looking for her. For all she knew, her company thought she had simply vanished, another casualty of the dangerous work they did. She had to save herself. The chain that held her to the wall was thick and secure, but the bolt that anchored it to the concrete was old and slightly loose. Sarah had discovered this during her second week and had been secretly working on it every night, twisting and pulling whenever she was alone. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the effort, but the bolt had gradually loosened. She began to prepare mentally for what would come next. She didn't know how many guards were in the building or where exactly she was being held. She didn't have weapons or tools or any way to contact help. All she had was her determination to live, and her growing anger at the people who had taken everything from her. Sarah thought about Emily, about her mother who lived in California, about all the normal, boring days she had taken for granted. She thought about her desk at the office, about traffic jams and bad coffee and annoying coworkers. All the things that had seemed like problems before, but now seemed like precious memories of freedom the morning of day 23. Victor brought her breakfast. He seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly. He set down the tray of bread and water without looking at her and turned to leave. "Victor," Sarah said softly. It was the first time she had spoken to any of the guards directly. He paused and looked back at her with surprise. "What? Is something happening?" "Everyone seems nervous." Victor's face darkened. "Mind your business," he said, and left quickly. But Sarah had seen the flash of fear in his eyes. Something was definitely wrong, and that meant she was running out of time. That night, Sarah worked on the bolt with renewed desperation. Her fingers were numb from the cold and slippery with blood, but she kept twisting and pulling. Around 2 in the morning, she felt it give way. The bolt came loose from the wall with a soft, grinding sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet basement. Sarah sat very still, her heart pounding, waiting to see if anyone had heard. Minutes passed. Nobody came. She was free from the wall, but still had the chain attached to the metal cuff around her ankle. She couldn't remove the cuff, but she could move now, could walk, could try to escape. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky from weeks of limited movement. The chain dragged behind her, making soft clinking sounds with each step. Sarah moved to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening. She could hear music playing somewhere above her, probably a radio or television. She could hear footsteps, but they sounded distant. This was it. This was her chance. Sarah had no idea what waited on the other side of that door, no plan beyond getting out of this room. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done being a victim, done being a prisoner. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her feet, fighting back. She tested the door handle slowly. Locked, as expected. But she remembered Victor's carelessness with the deadbolt. She examined the lock more closely in the dim light. It was old. Simple. Sarah pulled a wire from the hem of her shirt, something she had carefully extracted and hidden weeks ago. just in case. Her hands trembled as she worked the wire into the lock. She had never picked a lock before, had only seen it done in movies, but desperation made her fingers nimble. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she heard a soft click. The door was unlocked. Sarah took a deep breath, wrapped the chain around her arm to muffle its sound, and slowly pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was dimly lit and empty. To her left, she could see stairs leading up. To her right, the hallway disappeared into darkness. She stepped out of her prison, and in that moment, something fundamental changed inside her. The fear that had dominated her thoughts for 23 days transformed into cold, focused anger. These people had taken her freedom, threatened her family, and treated her like she was nothing. Sarah Chen had been the prisoner. But now, as she moved silently down that hallway, she felt something new awakening inside her. A hunter's instinct. A survivor's rage. She didn't just want to escape anymore. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And she wanted everyone who had done this to her to pay for what they had taken. The hunt was about to begin. Sarah moved through the dark hallway like a ghost. Every sense heightened by adrenaline and fear. The chain wrapped around her arm felt heavy, but she kept it tight to prevent any sound. Each step was calculated, each breath controlled. The building around her was old, industrial, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and walls that showed years of neglect. She reached a corner and pressed herself against the wall, peering around carefully. The corridor ahead led to what looked like a main room with lights spilling out from an open doorway. Sarah could hear voices now, speaking in Russian. She recognized Victor's laugh, rough and loud. There were at least 2 other voices, maybe 3. Her mind raced through options. She could try to find another exit, sneak past them somehow, get out of the building, and run. That would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But as Sarah stood there in the shadows, she thought about those 23 days, about the threats against Emily, about Dimitri's cold eyes as he showed her those photographs. Running away wouldn't solve anything. These people would still be out there, still operating, still hurting others. And they would come after her again, or worse, they would hurt her family just to send a message. No, running wasn't enough anymore. Sarah needed information. She needed to understand who these people were, what they were really doing. She needed evidence that could bring them down. She moved closer to the lit doorway, staying in the shadows. Through the opening, she could see a large room that had been converted into a makeshift living space. There was a table with several chairs, a small kitchen area, and what looked like a security monitor set up against one wall. 3 men sat around the table playing cards. Victor was there, along with 2 others she had seen during her captivity. No sign of Dimitri. On the table near the card game, Sarah spotted something that made her pulse quicken. A set of keys. They had to be the keys to the vehicles outside, to the rooms in the building, maybe even to the cuff on her ankle. But getting to them meant crossing an open space, where she would be completely visible. Sarah looked around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon or distraction. Her eyes fell on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall about 10 feet away. It was old and dusty, but it might work. She moved toward it slowly, testing each floorboard before putting her weight down. Terrified of making any sound that would give her away, she reached the fire extinguisher and carefully lifted it from its mount. It was heavier than she expected, which was good. Heavy meant it could do damage if needed. Sarah crept back toward the doorway, her plan forming as she moved. It was risky, probably stupid, but it was all she had. She positioned herself just outside the doorway, took a deep breath, and hurled the fire extinguisher as hard as she could toward the far end of the corridor, away from the room. It crashed against the wall with a tremendous bang that echoed through the entire building. The reaction was immediate. All 3 men jumped up from the table, knocking over chairs. They grabbed weapons, pistols that had been lying on a counter, and rushed toward the doorway. Sarah pressed herself flat against the wall as they ran past her. Shouting to each other in Russian, as soon as they were past, Sarah darted into the room. She grabbed the keys from the table and looked around frantically. The security monitors showed different views of the building, including her empty basement cell. There was a laptop sitting open on a desk near the monitors. Next to it was a cell phone. Sarah made a split-second decision. She grabbed the laptop, tucked it under her arm, and snatched the phone. She could hear the men returning, their voices angry and confused. There was no time to try the keys on her ankle cuff. She had to move now. There was another doorway on the opposite side of the room. Sarah ran toward it, her chain clanking despite her efforts to keep it quiet. Behind her, she heard shouting as the men discovered her gone from the basement and realized what had happened. The doorway led to a storage area filled with crates and boxes. Sarah ducked behind a stack of crates just as Victor burst into the room behind her. She could see him through a gap between boxes, his face red with anger and panic. He was shouting into a radio, alerting others in the building. Sarah's brief moment of advantage was disappearing fast. She needed to find a way out before they organized a proper search. She moved deeper into the storage area, away from Victor's voice, and found a small window high up on the wall. It was barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it would have to do. She stacked some crates beneath the window, wincing at the sound they made. Victor's voice was getting closer. Sarah climbed up on the crates, balanced the laptop and phone carefully, and tried to force the window open. It was stuck, probably hadn't been opened in years. She could hear footsteps right outside the storage area now. With a surge of desperate strength, Sarah slammed her palm against the window frame. Something gave way, and the window swung outward. Cold night air rushed in. She grabbed the laptop and phone, shoved them through the window, and pulled herself up. The window frame scraped against her shoulders as she squeezed through, and the chain on her ankle caught on something inside.
Out there.
Victor's shout rang out just as Sarah yanked her leg free, leaving a shoe behind. She tumbled out of the window and landed hard on concrete, the laptop skittering away from her. She was in an alley behind the building. She could see a street at one end with lights and traffic. Signs of normal civilization. Sarah grabbed the laptop, clutched the phone, and ran. The chain on her ankle slowed her down, and running with only one shoe made every step awkward and painful. Behind her, she heard more shouting. The sound of the building's back door crashing open. She reached the street and looked around wildly. It was late, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. There were still a few people around, some late-night workers, a couple walking home from a bar. Sarah ran toward them, waving her arm, trying to get attention. She shouted in English, then tried to remember any words in Hungarian or Russian. Police rend RSG. The couple stopped and stared at her with shock and fear. Sarah realized what she must look like, dirty and wild-eyed, wearing one shoe, with a chain hanging from her ankle and a laptop clutched to her chest. But before they could react, a car came screeching around the corner. It was one of the black vehicles Sarah had seen parked near the warehouse. Victor leaned out the passenger window with a gun. The couple on the street screamed and dove for cover. Sarah turned and ran in the opposite direction, her lungs burning, her bare foot bleeding on the rough pavement. The car accelerated after her. Sarah spotted a narrow passageway between 2 buildings and darted into it. The car couldn't follow, but she could hear doors opening, footsteps chasing her. The passageway led to another street, this one busier, with all-night shops and restaurants. Sarah burst out onto the sidewalk and almost collided with a taxi that was dropping off passengers. Without thinking, she yanked open the back door and jumped inside, slamming it behind her. The driver, an older man with a gray beard, turned around with surprise that quickly changed to alarm when he saw her condition. "Drive," Sarah gasped. "Please, they're trying to kill me." "Drive now." The driver hesitated for just a second, looking past her to where Victor and another guard were running out of the passageway. That was enough. He threw the car into gear and accelerated away from the curb just as Victor reached for the door handle. Sarah looked back through the rear window and saw Victor standing in the middle of the street. His face twisted with rage, the gun still in his hand but unable to shoot with so many witnesses around. The taxi turned a corner and he disappeared from view.
"To, miss?"
The driver asked in heavily accented English, his eyes constantly flicking to her in the rearview mirror. Sarah realized she had no idea where she was. No money, no passport, no way to prove who she was. But she had the laptop, the phone, and keys that might contain crucial information. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere she could access help and figure out her next move. American Embassy, she said, then remembered she wasn't sure which city she was in. Where are we? What city? Budapest, the driver replied. But miss, you need hospital, yes? You are hurt, and that chain. No hospital, Sarah said firmly. Embassy first. It's urgent. Life or death. The driver nodded slowly and changed direction. Sarah sat back in the seat, her whole body shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She looked down at the laptop in her lap, at the phone in her hand. Whatever was on these devices had to be important enough to help authorities take down Dimitri's operation. It had to be worth everything she had just risked. She turned on the phone, hoping it wasn't password protected. The screen lit up, showing a home screen in Russian. Sarah's heart sank until she noticed the phone was still logged into several apps, including encrypted messaging. She began scrolling through the messages, using the phone's translation feature to understand them. What she found made her blood run cold. The messages detailed operations across multiple countries, not just financial crimes, but trafficking, blackmail, and worse. There were names of government officials, business leaders, people in positions of power who were either victims or collaborators. And there, in a message thread from 2 days ago, she found her own name. The message chain was between Dimitri and someone identified only as the director. They were discussing what to do with her. Dimitri had wanted to keep using her for information, but the director had ordered her elimination. The hit was scheduled for that very morning, just hours away. If Sarah hadn't escaped when she did, she would have been killed and her body disposed of, another person who had simply vanished without a trace. But there was more. The messages mentioned someone inside Sentinel Security Solutions. Her own company, who was feeding information to Dimitri's network. That was how they had known she was investigating them. How they had known exactly when and where to grab her in Budapest. Someone she worked with, maybe someone she trusted, had betrayed her. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. The betrayal went deeper than she had imagined. She couldn't simply go to her company for help because she didn't know who the mole was. And if she contacted the wrong person, they would alert Dimitri. And she would lose her only advantage. The fact that she had escaped with evidence. The taxi pulled up to the American Embassy gates. Sarah could see armed guards and security barriers. It looked safe. It looked like sanctuary. But as she reached for the door handle, another thought stopped her cold. If there was a mole in her company, there might be corruption in other places too. The messages on the phone had mentioned people in government positions. What if someone at the embassy was compromised? What if walking through those gates meant walking into another trap? Sarah sat frozen, her hand on the door handle, her mind racing. The taxi driver was watching her expectantly. Behind them, traffic moved normally, people going about their early morning routines. Completely unaware of the danger Sarah carried with her, she made a decision. She asked the driver to take her to a different location, an internet cafe she had spotted a few blocks back. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out who she could trust. She needed to download the information from the laptop and phone, back it up, create insurance for herself. As the taxi pulled away from the embassy, Sarah looked down at the devices in her lap. She had escaped captivity, but her ordeal was far from over. She wasn't just running anymore. She was hunting now, hunting for the truth, hunting for the people who had betrayed her, hunting for justice. The prisoner had become the hunter, and she was just getting started. The internet cafe was tucked into a basement-level shop that smelled of old coffee and cigarette smoke. Sarah paid the taxi driver with money she found in the phone's case, probably belonging to one of her captors. The driver gave her a concerned look before pulling away. Clearly worried about the strange American woman with a chain on her ankle and no shoes, Sarah limped into the cafe, trying to look as normal as possible despite her appearance. The young man behind the counter barely looked up from his own phone as she requested a computer in the back corner. She chose a station that gave her a view of both the entrance and the emergency exit. Positioning herself so nobody could see her screen, her hands shook as she connected the stolen laptop to the cafe's internet. She created several anonymous email accounts, and began systematically uploading every file she could find. Financial records, correspondence, photographs, encrypted documents that she couldn't open but saved anyway. Everything went to the cloud, backed up in multiple locations under different names. The phone was even more valuable. Sarah went through the messaging apps, taking screenshots of everything. The conversations revealed a network that spanned from Eastern Europe to Asia, from South America to North America. Money laundering, weapons trafficking, human trafficking, corporate espionage, political blackmail. Dimitri's organization was involved in it all. But the most disturbing discovery was the list of names in a file marked assets. These were people who worked for governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, even international organizations like Interpol. Some were marked with red flags, indicating they were being blackmailed. Others had green checks, suggesting they were willing participants. And there, buried in the middle of the list, was a name that made Sarah's stomach drop. Marcus Webb, her boss at Sentinel Security Solutions. Marcus had been the one who sent her to Budapest. He had personally assigned her to investigate the financial network. He had assured her it was safe, that she would have backup, that everything was under control. And all along, he had been setting her up, delivering her straight into Dimitri's hands. Sarah sat back from the computer, her mind reeling. She thought about all the times Marcus had seemed like a mentor, someone who believed in her potential. She remembered conversations in his office, advice he had given her, encouragement when she doubted herself. All of it had been a lie. He had been using her, and when she became inconvenient, he had arranged for her to be captured and eventually killed. The rage that surged through her was different from anything she had felt before. It was cold and focused, a burning determination that cleared away all the fear and doubt. Sarah had spent 3 weeks as a victim, helpless and terrified. But now she had information, evidence, and most importantly, she had nothing left to lose. She spent the next 2 hours going through everything on both devices, creating a detailed map of the organization's structure. Dimitri wasn't at the top. He answered to someone called the director, whose real identity wasn't revealed in any of the communications. But Sarah found patterns in the messages, references that helped her narrow down possibilities. The director communicated primarily from locations in Switzerland and Monaco. The writing style suggested someone educated, probably with a military or intelligence background. Several messages referenced the old days in our service together, suggesting connections to former Soviet intelligence. And there was one crucial detail. The director had a daughter studying at Cambridge University in England. Sarah took note of everything, storing it in her memory and in the encrypted cloud backups she had created. Then she began phase 2 of her plan. She couldn't go to the authorities directly, not when she didn't know who was compromised. But she could create pressure. It'd start disrupting the network from the outside. She accessed the dark web using tools she found on the stolen laptop. Dimitri's people had been using this computer for their operations, which meant it had all the necessary software and security clearances. Sarah navigated to forums where investigative journalists gathered, places where whistleblowers shared information with people who knew how to use it. She created a new identity and began posting carefully selected pieces of evidence. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to get attention. Financial records showing suspicious transactions. Screenshots of conversations proving corruption. Names and dates and locations. She spread the information across multiple platforms, making it impossible to contain or suppress. Within an hour, her posts were getting responses. Journalists from reputable outlets asking for verification. Hackers offering to help dig deeper. Anonymous accounts claiming to have additional information about the same network. Sarah had lit a fuse, and now she needed to make sure it led to the right. Explosion. She left the internet cafe as morning light began filling the streets of Budapest. She had used one of the keys from the stolen ring to finally remove the ankle cuff, leaving it in the bathroom trash. She bought shoes, clothes, and basic supplies from a street market. Paying cash and avoiding any interaction that might be remembered later, Sarah found a small hotel that didn't ask too many questions and paid for a week in advance. In her room, she finally allowed herself to rest, though sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too active, too focused on what came next. She had damaged Dimitri's organization by releasing that information, but they were still out there. Marcus Webb was still free. The director remained hidden, and Sarah was still in danger. She needed allies. People she could trust who had the skills and resources to help her finish what she had started. She thought about her former colleagues at Sentinel, going through each person in her mind, trying to determine who might still be clean. There was one person who stood out, Jennifer Park, field operative who had always seemed skeptical of Marcus, who asked too many questions and challenged his decisions. Sarah used the burner phone she had bought at the market to call Jennifer's personal cell, not her work number. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello? Jennifer, it's Sarah Chen. Don't hang up and don't tell anyone you're talking to me." There was a long pause. "Sarah, everyone thinks you're dead. Marcus said you went dark in Budapest over 3 weeks ago. Where are you? Are you okay? I'm alive, but I need your help. And I need you to trust me when I say that everything you think you know about what happened to me is a lie." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes telling Jennifer everything, or almost everything. She left out specific details about where she was or what evidence she had. But she explained Marcus's betrayal, the organization she had uncovered, and the danger that still existed. Jennifer listened without interrupting, and when Sarah finished, there was another long silence. "Jesus Christ," Jennifer finally said. "I knew something was off about that assignment. Marcus was too insistent that you be the one to go, and he kept everyone else away from the case. But I never imagined this. Can you help me? I need someone on the inside, someone who can access files and information without raising suspicion. What do you need?" "Everything you can find on Marcus Webb. His communications, his finances, his travel records, who he meets with. Also, I need you to look into a couple of other people on the Sentinel staff. I'll send you names. But Jennifer, you have to be careful. If Marcus realizes you're investigating him, he'll move against you, just like he did against me." "I understand. But Sarah, what are you planning to do with all this? Even with evidence, taking down someone like Marcus, exposing this kind of corruption, it's not something you can do alone." Sarah looked at her reflection in the hotel room mirror. She barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner, harder, her eyes different somehow. The woman looking back at her wasn't the analyst who had left Washington weeks ago. That woman had been naive, trusting, soft. This woman was something else entirely. "I'm not planning to do it alone," Sarah said, "but I am going to finish it. These people took everything from me. They threatened my family. They tried to kill me. I'm going to make sure they all pay for what they've done." After ending the call with Jennifer, Sarah began the next phase of her plan. She had evidence. She had an ally inside Sentinel, and she had identified most of the key players in the network. But evidence and knowledge weren't enough. She needed to draw them out, to force mistakes, to create opportunities to take them down one by one. She started with the lower-level operatives whose names she had found in the files. Using the information from the stolen devices, she sent anonymous messages to several of them. Messages that suggested she knew about their activities, that she had evidence that the police were closing in. She wanted them nervous, wanted them to panic and make mistakes. Then she went after the financial networks. Sarah accessed the shell company accounts using credentials. She found on the laptop and began transferring money to legitimate charities and anti-corruption organizations. Not all of it, not enough to alert the major players immediately, but enough to disrupt operations and create confusion. Each action was calculated to create maximum disruption while minimizing risk to herself. She was fighting a shadow war, striking from hiding, using their own systems against them. It was guerrilla tactics applied to financial crime and espionage. 3 days into her campaign, Sarah received a message from Jennifer with an attachment. It was Marcus Webb's complete file, including information that even Sarah with her analyst skills hadn't been able to find. Marcus had been recruited by Dimitri's organization 5 years earlier, or shortly after a gambling debt had nearly destroyed his life. He had been blackmailed at first, then gradually became a willing participant as the money got better. But the most important piece of information was Marcus's schedule. He was flying to Zurich in 2 days for a meeting with what the file described as high-value contacts. Sarah knew immediately that this had to be a meeting with the director. This was her chance to identify the person at the top of the organization. She booked a flight to Zurich using a fake identity that cost most of her remaining cash. She spent her last day in Budapest preparing, buying supplies she would need, studying maps of Zurich, memorizing the addresses of buildings mentioned in the files. She was walking into the heart of enemy territory with no backup, no weapons, and no guarantee of survival. The old Sarah would have been terrified. The old Sarah would have gone to the authorities and let them handle it. But the old Sarah was gone, left behind in that basement prison where she had spent 3 weeks in chains. This Sarah, the one who had escaped, who had turned the tables on her captors, who had begun dismantling their organization piece by piece, this Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. She was determined. And she was hunting. As her plane lifted off from Budapest, Sarah looked down at the city disappearing below her. Somewhere down there, Dmitri and Victor were probably still searching for her. Still trying to figure out how their prisoner had escaped and stolen their secrets. Let them search. By the time they figured out where she had gone, it would be too late. Sarah Chen had been the prey, hunted and trapped and nearly destroyed. But she had survived, adapted, and transformed. Now she was the predator, and her prey had no idea what was coming for them. The game had changed, and Sarah was just getting started. Zurich was cold and rainy when Sarah arrived, the gray weather matching her mood perfectly. She checked into a modest hotel near the train station using another fake identity, paying cash for everything. She had learned to move through the world like a ghost, leaving no digital footprint, no trail for anyone to follow. The meeting Marcus was scheduled to attend was set for the following evening at a private club in the financial district. Sarah spent her first day in Zurich conducting surveillance, learning the area, identifying escape routes and observation points. She watched the club from different angles, noting security cameras, guard positions, and the flow of people in and out. The club itself was housed in a historic building with classic architecture and understated elegance. It was the kind of place where the world's wealthy and powerful met to conduct business away from public scrutiny. Getting inside would be nearly impossible without an invitation or membership. But Sarah didn't need to get inside. She just needed to identify who Marcus was meeting with. She rented a car and positioned it near the club's private parking area, a spot that gave her a clear view of the entrance while keeping her hidden in shadow. She arrived 3 hours before the scheduled meeting, using the time to review everything she knew. To prepare mentally for what might come next, Marcus arrived first. Stepping out of a black sedan with diplomatic plates, Sarah felt a surge of cold anger seeing him, remembering his friendly smiles, his encouragement, all while he had been setting her up to be captured and killed. She took photos with the camera she had purchased, documenting his arrival. Over the next hour, several other people arrived. Sarah recognized 2 from the files, a banker who specialized in moving illicit funds, and a former intelligence officer who now worked as a security consultant for various criminal enterprises. She photographed them all, building her case, gathering evidence. Then, at exactly the scheduled time, another car arrived. This one was different, clearly armored, with tinted windows and professional security. 2 bodyguards stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced efficiency. Then a third person emerged from the vehicle, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew this face. Everyone in the intelligence community knew this face. Alexander Volkov, former colonel in Russian military intelligence, who had supposedly retired years ago to pursue private business interests. He was connected to everything: arms deals, political manipulation, financial crimes that spanned continents, and he had always managed to stay just out of reach of prosecution. Protected by connections and vast resources, this was the director. Sarah had found the head of the organization that had nearly killed her. She took dozens of photos as Volkov entered the club, the security team following close behind. She documented everything: the time, the license plates, the faces of everyone who had attended. This was the evidence she needed: proof of the connections, proof of the conspiracy. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with just taking pictures. She had come too far, endured too much, to settle for passive observation. She wanted these people to know she was still alive, still fighting, still dangerous. She wanted them to feel the fear she had felt in that basement. She left her car and walked to the club's service entrance, an area she had identified during her earlier surveillance. A delivery truck was parked there, the driver inside the club making a drop-off. Sarah slipped past the truck and found the building's utilities junction box. She had studied the building's systems online and knew exactly what to look for. Using tools she had bought at a hardware store, Sarah carefully accessed the electrical panel. She wasn't trying to cause permanent damage, just a temporary disruption. She set a timer using a simple device she had assembled from parts purchased separately, completely untraceable. In 15 minutes, the power to the club would cut out for exactly 3 minutes, long enough to create panic and confusion, long enough for security systems to fail, long enough for Sarah to deliver a message. She moved to the club's front entrance as the timer counted down. She wore a dark coat and had her hair tucked under a cap, making her appearance deliberately forgettable. When the power cut out right on schedule, the street lights and building lights went dark. People inside the club started emerging, confused and concerned. In the chaos, Sarah walked up to Marcus Webb, who was standing near the entrance looking at his phone. She stepped close enough that only he could hear her. "Hello, Marcus," she said softly. He looked up, and his face went white. For a moment, he seemed frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Sarah Chen, who should have been dead, standing right in front of him. "Sarah, how did you—" "I escaped," she interrupted. "And I know everything. I know about your deal with Volkov. I know about all the people you've betrayed. I have all the evidence, Marcus. Every file, every message, every transaction. It's already been copied and distributed to people who will know what to do with it." "You don't understand," Marcus stammered. "They would have killed me if I didn't cooperate. They have dirt on everyone. You can't fight this." "Watch me," Sarah said coldly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm alive, and I'm coming for all of you. Every single person involved in this network. You should have killed me when you had the chance." The lights came back on, and Sarah melted back into the crowd before Marcus could react or call for security. She walked quickly, but calmly, away from the club, her heart pounding, but her mind clear. She had delivered her message. Now they would know she was hunting them. Over the next week, Sarah continued her campaign. She leaked more information to journalists, providing them with specific details about Volkov's operations that only someone with inside knowledge could have. Major news outlets began running stories about corruption in the financial sector, about connections between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. Jennifer, working from inside Sentinel Security, provided Sarah with additional intelligence. Together, they identified which authorities could be trusted and which were compromised. They built a network of allies, honest law enforcement officers, investigative journalists, hackers who believed in exposing corruption. Sarah also reached out to other victims of the organization. The files had contained information about people who had been blackmailed or threatened. She contacted several of them anonymously, offering them a chance to testify, to expose their blackmailers, promising protection and support. Many were too afraid to help, but some agreed, adding their voices to the growing chorus demanding justice. The pressure was building. Volkov's organization began to fracture as lower-level operatives turned against each other, trying to save themselves. Financial accounts were frozen as authorities in multiple countries began coordinating investigations. The network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was beginning to collapse. But Volkov himself remained elusive. He disappeared from his usual haunts, went dark on all communications. Sarah knew he was planning something, regrouping for a counterattack. And she knew that she remained his primary target. She had humiliated him, damaged his organization, and become a symbol of resistance against his power. The confrontation came 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival in Zurich. She was staying in a different hotel now, her 5th location since arriving in the city. She had just returned from a meeting with a journalist when she noticed something wrong. The hotel's parking garage was too quiet, the security guard missing from his usual post. Sarah's instincts, honed by weeks of living on the edge, screamed danger. She turned to leave, but it was too late. Two men stepped out from behind pillars, blocking her exit. She recognized them from the files. Professional killers, Volkov's personal security team. "Miss Chen," one of them said in accented English. "Mr. Volkov would like to speak with you. Please come with us." Sarah's hand moved to the small pepper spray canister she now carried everywhere. But she knew it would be useless against trained operatives. She was cornered, just like she had been in Budapest. But this time, she wasn't unprepared. This time, she had a plan. "Tell Volkov I'll meet him," Sarah said. "But in a public place with witnesses? Not like this." Men looked at each other uncertainly. Apparently, they had expected her to run or fight, not negotiate. Before they could respond, Sarah's phone rang. She answered it, keeping her eyes on the men. "This is Agent Sarah Chen," she said loudly, clearly. "Yes, I'm in the parking garage of the Hotel Schweizerhof. There are 2 hostile contacts approaching. Please send backup immediately." It was a bluff. Sarah wasn't a field agent, and she had no backup to call. But the men didn't know that. They hesitated, looking around nervously, suddenly aware of security cameras, of potential witnesses, of the risks of being exposed in a public location. One of them spoke quickly into a radio, then looked back at Sarah. "Mr. Volkov says you have 1 hour. The cafe across from the train station? Come alone, or your sister in Seattle receives a visit from our associates." They left quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the parking garage. Sarah stood there for a moment, her hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through her veins. They had threatened Emily again. They still thought they could control her through fear, through threats against the people she loved. But Sarah had been preparing for this. She had already moved her mother and sister to a safe location. Guarded by private security, Jennifer had arranged through trusted contacts. Volkov's people would find empty houses, nothing to leverage against her. Sarah went to the meeting anyway, but not alone. She had Jennifer on an open phone line in her pocket, recording everything. She had informed 3 different journalists about the meeting location and time, giving them the option to observe from a distance. And she had contacted Detective Klaus Weber of the Zurich police, one of the few officers Jennifer had verified as being clean, giving him enough information to justify surveillance. The cafe was crowded with afternoon customers when Sarah arrived. Alexander Volkov sat alone at a corner table, looking relaxed despite the situation. He was older than his photo suggested, maybe in his late 60s, with iron gray hair and cold blue eyes that assessed Sarah as she approached. "Miss Chen," he said pleasantly as she sat down, "you have been remarkably resourceful. I underestimated you, which doesn't happen often." "You tried to have me killed," Sarah said flatly. "Multiple times?" Dusnus Volkov replied with a shrug. "Nothing personal. You were investigating matters that could damage my operations. I couldn't allow that. But now circumstances have changed. You have created significant problems for me, I admit. Your campaign of information warfare has been quite effective. Is there a point to this conversation?" Volkov leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a proposition. Join me. Work for me. You clearly have skills that are valuable. Intelligence, resourcefulness, determination. I pay extremely well, and I protect my people. The alternative is that we continue this conflict, which will end badly for both of us." Sarah almost laughed. "You think I would work for you after everything you've done?" "I think you're a pragmatist," Volkov said. "You've survived impossible situations because you're willing to adapt to do what's necessary. That's a quality I admire. The idealistic girl who worked for Sentinel is gone. The woman sitting across from me now is a survivor, a fighter. Someone like that understands that idealism is expensive and loyalty is a commodity." "You're wrong," Sarah said quietly. "The woman sitting across from you is someone who spent 3 weeks in a basement, terrified and helpless. Someone who was betrayed by people she trusted. Someone who decided that being afraid wasn't good enough anymore. I'm not here to join you, Volkov. I'm here to watch you fall." Volkov's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You're making a mistake." "No," Sarah said. You made the mistake when you took me prisoner instead of just leaving me alone. Because now, I know exactly how your organization works. And I've spent the last month making sure that when you fall hard." She stood up to leave, but Volkov spoke again. "Your sister, Emily. Your mother, Margaret. Do you really think you can protect them forever? I have resources you can't imagine. Patience you can't match. Eventually you'll slip, and when you do, Detective Weber," Sarah said loudly. And the plainclothes officer, who had been sitting 2 tables away, stood up, along with 3 other officers positioned around the cafe. "I believe you have enough evidence now for an arrest warrant." Volkov's face finally showed emotion, surprise, then calculation, then cold anger. But he was trapped. The conversation had been recorded. His threats had been witnessed. And more importantly, international investigations that Sarah's information had sparked had finally produced warrants in multiple countries. As the Swiss police surrounded him, Volkov looked at Sarah one last time. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Sarah replied. "It is." The arrest made international headlines. Alexander Volkov detained in Zurich on charges of money laundering, conspiracy, and corruption. Within days, others in his network were arrested. Marcus Webb in Washington, Dmitry and Victor in Budapest, the banker and former intelligence officer from the Zurich meeting. The entire organization began to unravel as people rushed to cut deals and testify against each other. Sarah cooperated with multiple law enforcement agencies, providing testimony and evidence. Her story came out: the kidnapping, the imprisonment, the threats, her escape, and subsequent investigation. She became known as the analyst who had brought down one of the world's most dangerous criminal networks. But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, worn down by the weeks of fear and fighting and constant vigilance. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. She had lost her innocence, her trust in people, her ability to feel truly safe. The basement prisoner was gone, and in her place was someone harder, someone who saw threats in every shadow. 6 months after Volkov's arrest, Sarah sat in a small apartment in Seattle, where she had moved to be closer to Emily. Her sister was safe, their mother was safe, and the people who had threatened them were all in prison or awaiting trial. Justice had been served. Sarah worked as a consultant now, helping law enforcement agencies understand financial crimes and criminal networks. She was good at it, better than she had been as an analyst at Sentinel, because she understood how criminals thought. She had been inside their world, had seen it from both sides, but sometimes, late at night, she still dreamed about that basement. She still woke up thinking she heard chains clinking, still felt phantom sensations of metal around her ankle. The trauma would probably never fully heal. The fear would always be there, buried under the surface. What had changed was how she dealt with it. Sarah Chen had learned that fear didn't have to be paralyzing. It could be fuel. It could drive you to fight back, to refuse to be a victim, to transform from prey into predator. She had been the prisoner, trapped and helpless in that dark basement, counting days and waiting to die. But she had escaped, adapted, and struck back. She had become the hunter, pursuing justice with the same ruthless determination that her captors had used to pursue profit. The experience had broken something in her, but it had also forged something new. Sarah wasn't the naive analyst anymore, but she wasn't just a hardened survivor either. She was something in between, someone who had seen the worst of humanity but still chose to fight against it. Someone who had been victimized but refused to remain a victim. As she looked out her apartment window at the Seattle skyline, Sarah thought about all the people Volkov's organization had hurt. All the victims who hadn't been as lucky or resourceful as she had been. She thought about the people still trapped in situations like hers, still waiting for someone to rescue them. Maybe that was her purpose now. Not just to survive, but to help others survive. Not just to hunt the predators, but to protect the prey. She had the skills, the knowledge, the experience. And she had something else. The absolute certainty that being afraid wasn't enough. That sometimes you had to transform. Had to become something fierce and dangerous to survive in a fierce and dangerous world. Sarah Chen had been the prisoner, had become the hunter. Now she was something more, a guardian, standing between the predators and their prey, refusing to let anyone else endure what she had endured. The mission that had started in that Budapest basement wasn't over. It was just beginning, and Sarah was ready for whatever came next.